Alright, so moving on to the next video in the Learn to Code playlist, we are going to start talking about arrays. Now, in all of the previous videos, we've been storing values in a single variable, but what if we have a lot of variables? Can we store multiple values in one variable? And the answer to that question is yes. We certainly can. We have to use a new tool, and that's going to be using an array. So if we start to look into arrays, it's a little bit different of syntax. So to declare an array, we really want to know the variable type here. I believe this is the first time we're also using the square brackets, and what's inside of the square brackets, that's going to specify the number of elements in an array. We will also be using our favorite squiggly brackets to define the element in the array. So in this case, our elements would be X, Y, and Z. So if we look at some examples, we would have the variable type. So we have an int here. We would have our array name. So we just called it numbers. And then our square brackets. And then we're going to have two elements. So we put a 2 there. And then that's going to be equal to our elements. So we have a 1 and a 2. And those are encompassed by these squiggly brackets right here. But we're not just limited to integers or numbers. We can also have strings. So our data type is string. Our array name is names. We're going to have 3 elements, and we're going to have Bob, John, and Bill. Notice here, because we have strings, we need these quotation marks. And from introducing arrays, we can ask, how can we make them useful? So some things that you might want to do is access a certain element of an array. And to do that, well, we have to realize that the way that these arrays are structured is that this first element is the 0th element. So if we looked at names and then we had the 0th element right here, that would correspond to Bob. But you also might want to modify an element. Now it's a similar procedure, kind of like declaring a variable. So in this case, we are looking at the names array. And because we have the number 2 here, we are looking at the second element, but remember we start with the 0th. So we would have the 0th up here, the first, and then the second. So this 2 right here would correspond to Bill, and we could change that element. Now we're not just limited to accessing one element of an array, we can access multiple elements, or we can tie things in from previous videos and look at loops and arrays. Now to call each element for an array, you could use a for loop, and that's perfectly fine. But within C++ for the latest versions within, I think, the last decade, there's actually this for each loop, which is unique for things like arrays. And the syntax looks something like this. Now, we're not going to skip ahead to using this right away just because it's there, because learning the basic method of just using the normal for loop translates quite well to other programming languages. Another thing that might be useful is looking at the size of the array. This is a little bit confusing because there is this command size of, and then you have parentheses where you would put what your array is, and you might think this would give you the number of elements in your array. But it does not. It gives the array size in bytes. Now this might be a little bit confusing at why this is the case, but once we start getting into the data types video, which I believe is 2 videos from now, we will investigate this more. But nevertheless, this size of command right here does not give you the number of elements. But there is a way to do that. We can use something like this line of code here, where it is appropriate to have an integer, and we just have the size of, in this case we're using the numbers array, and then we're dividing that by size of, and then we are looking at the 0th element here inside of numbers. But again, 2 videos from now this will make a little bit more sense hopefully. So one of the reasons you might want the size of an array is, imagine if you have a ton of elements and you're trying to use some for loop to get through some of them or a combination of them, and you don't know when to stop that for loop. Well, you can set that termination condition to happen once your initialization parameter meets this array size. And arrays aren't just this limited, so we don't actually need to specify the number of elements inside these square brackets here. We can just fill out each of the elements here, and you can think of this value then kind of sort of just getting auto-populated per se. Or you can keep the array size and simply not define the elements in it, so you kind of have this empty array that you can fill with information later. So to do that, we would just create this array like this. So we're going to say that the array has 2 elements, and then later on in the code we would specify the 0th and the first element, and then these 2 arrays, this one and this one up here, would be the same. But unfortunately we cannot have our cake and eat it too, and you can't leave everything blank and expect things to work out nicely. So if you're going to try to shorthand things, you have to stick to these 2 methods. And if we start to look back at a previous video, we saw that we can put a loop inside of a loop, and maybe we asked the question, can we array an array? And again, that answer is yes. So arrays are very useful, as you can see. So we can create a matrix or 2D array, and it's going to follow the syntax shown here. And then instead of just one number in brackets, you're going to have 2 numbers in their own set of square brackets. So this first number is going to represent the rows, and the second number is going to represent the columns. Now the format is shown here, so we have our general squiggly brackets, and inside of those we again have another subset of squiggly brackets, and that's going to define each row. So if you're looking for kind of a mathematical representation, this would look something like this. Now you can also create a 3D array. It's possible. We're not going to do it in this video or this course. So if we hop into Visual Studio, we're going to look at a basic program using an array and all the things that we've talked about here. So the purpose of this program is, let's say we have a sample size of 5 people and they gave their birth year. We're going to store that in the array birth year. And this program is going to figure out the oldest and the youngest person in the room. So for some user interaction, we're also going to define an integer as current year. And then in our terminal, it's just going to output what is the current year. It's going to take in some input that you input. It's going to store that in the current year. And then we should have all the info we need. So to calculate the age of everyone, we are going to have some integer I, some array, and we're going to say that the array has 5 elements in it to match the array size of the birth year. And then we are going to have our for loop. So our initialization condition here, we're going to have I being equal to 0. And then we're going to say for I less or equal to. And then in this right here, we are finding the number of elements in the array. And then we're subtracting 1 because we know we start at the 0th element. That would be right here. So really we want that for loop to go from I equal to 0 all the way to I equal to 4. And then we just increment I as necessary. And then inside that for loop, we're really just saying that the element, each element for the ages array is going to be equal to the current year that we enter minus the birth year. But notice here we're using I for that as well, so we're just doing it element by element, finding the age. And then here we just have a commented out line of code that would just be a check to make sure that we're getting the right answer for the ages. And now we can get into the part that finds the youngest and oldest people in the room. Now you could go ahead and make your own comparison loops. You could make your own functions to do that. But I think with the scope of this video just being arrays, we are going to do a little shortcut here. So in line 3, we are actually including a header file. And we're going to be including the algorithm. And that's going to allow us to do some pretty nice stuff. So in line 21 here and 22, we defined young and old. And essentially what we're going to do for young is we are going to find the minimum element in the ages array that we just calculated. And we just populated the ages array with this for loop here. Now you can see here we have a lot of stuff we haven't talked about before. we have this begin and end, which is just going to search through the beginning and the end of the ages array. And then we also have this asterisk right here, and that's going to relate to pointers. We don't know what those are right now. We're going to get to that again in a later video. But for now, just know that these are shortcuts to find the minimum and maximum values in the array. So after we find those, we're simply just going to output that the youngest person is whatever we found for the youngest value or the minimal value, and the oldest person is whatever we found for that old value. So what we can do is run the code, and we can see here that we outputted what is the current year. Now I'm recording this in 2024, but this video is probably going to go out in 2025. So if we type in 2025 and hit enter, it's going to say the youngest person is 19 and the oldest person is 123. And we can verify that our code is working correctly. So if you learned anything new or useful, please like, comment, share, subscribe. And we will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.